My mom left me alone in a hospital, then blamed me for ruining her vacation. She sided with her new husband, ignored my pain, and chose to abandon me when I needed her most. But when my dad found out, he took me away, reported her to CPS, and never let her hurt me again. Now, she's alone, desperate, and I finally have a real home. Before Kevin came into the picture, my life wasn't perfect, but at least it was familiar. My parents had been married for years, though looking back, I don't think they were ever truly happy together. They argued often, sometimes over big things, but mostly about day-to-day responsibilities. My dad worked long hours trying to keep up with the bills while my mom stayed home. At least she was supposed to. Mom was technically a stay-at-home parent, but she never really embraced the role. Cooking, cleaning, helping me with homework, those weren't her priorities. Instead, she spent most of her time glued to her phone, obsessed with trying to build an online following. She called herself a beauty influencer, even though her audience was barely a few hundred people. Every spare moment was spent recording videos, snapping photos, or editing posts. It didn't matter if we were at home, in the car, or even out for dinner, her phone was always in her hand, filtering reality through the lens of her online persona. When she wasn't focused on social media, she was out spending money, my dad's money, on shopping trips, brunches, and beauty treatments. She had this routine: salon visits, manicures, facials, new clothes, repeat. It was as if she saw herself as a celebrity, despite the fact that no one outside of our household really cared. Meanwhile, the things that most moms did, checking my schoolwork, making sure I ate properly, actually spending time with me, were nothing more than afterthoughts to her. The only thing she ever really cared about when it came to me was how I looked. She wanted me to be a reflection of her, not a person with my own thoughts and choices. She'd make comments if I gained even a little weight, insisting that I needed to watch what I ate. She always expected me to look put together, as if I was an accessory to her image rather than her daughter. When my parents finally announced their divorce 3 years ago, I wasn't surprised. In fact, I think I had been waiting for it. The fighting had gotten worse, and even though they tried to keep things civil in front of me, I could always hear the tension in their voices. They argued about money, about responsibilities, about the fact that my dad was always at work and my mom was always doing anything but taking care of the house. At first, I thought the divorce might actually be a good thing. Maybe with the fighting over, things would calm down. Maybe I'd even get to spend more time with my dad, who had always been the more stable parent. But the way things worked out, I ended up splitting my time between them, half the week with mom, half the week with dad. Adjusting to 2 different households wasn't easy. My dad, despite working a lot, at least tried to be present when we were together. He'd ask me about school, help me with homework, cook dinner, even if it was just something simple like pasta or grilled cheese. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like home. With my mom, it was a different story. Now that she was single, she had even more time for herself, or at least that's how she saw it. She spent her nights out with friends, going to bars or weekend getaways, treating her life like one long social media highlight reel. She wasn't really interested in being a mom, but she also wasn't willing to let my dad have full custody either. Not because she wanted me, just because she didn't want to lose. For a little while, things were manageable. I learned how to keep my head down and adapt to the rhythm of each household. But just as I was settling into the new routine, Mom met Kevin. And that was when everything changed. It didn't take long for my mom to jump back into dating after the divorce. In fact, she was excited about it, like a teenager getting ready for prom. She spent even more time on her appearance, obsessing over outfits and posting flirty selfies with captions like, "New Beginnings Red Heart," or "Ready for the Next Chapter." It was exhausting to watch. Then came Kevin. I still remember the day she first mentioned him. She was practically glowing, gushing about how he was different from any man she had ever met. She said he was established and responsible, that he knew how to take charge, whatever that meant. Within weeks, she was calling him her soulmate. And within months, he had completely taken over our lives. Kevin wasn't just some guy my mom was dating. He was a force. From the moment they got together, it was clear that he expected to be in control of everything. He wasn't just dating my mom, he was inserting himself into every aspect of our household. It started small. He dropped comments about how things should be done around the house, how I should be more disciplined, how my mom needed to set stricter rules, how he believed kids these days were too soft. Then he started showing up all the time. If I came home from school, there he was, making himself comfortable on our couch. If I wanted to have dinner alone with my mom, he was always there. It was as if I no longer had one-on-one time with her. She belonged to Kevin now. Then, the worst part, he moved in. It wasn't even a slow transition. One day, Mom just announced it out of nowhere. Kevin and the boys are moving in. Isn't that great? No, it wasn't great. Because Kevin didn't come alone. He had 2 sons who were only a little younger than me. And if I thought Kevin was bad, his kids were worse. Kevin's sons, Brandon and Jake, were nightmares. They had zero understanding of personal space, barging into my room whenever they wanted, taking my things without asking, and acting as if the entire house belonged to them. I'd be trying to do homework and suddenly Brandon would be in my room, messing with my stuff. I'd tell him to leave and he'd laugh, calling me bossy or stuck up. If I locked my door, Kevin would yell at me, saying it was disrespectful to keep family out. Jake was even worse. He was a little bully, always making fun of me for being too girly or for spending time alone. If I wore a dress, he'd roll his eyes and mutter something about how I was trying too hard. If I played music, he'd make fun of my taste. Nothing I did was ever okay in that house. And Kevin? He encouraged it. Instead of stepping in, he'd laugh along with his sons as if humiliating me was some fun family bonding activity. He'd say things like, "Oh, she's just being sensitive. You know how girls are." If I ever complained to my mom, she'd wave it off with some excuse like, "That's just how boys joke around," or "You need to learn how to take a joke." But it wasn't funny. It was humiliating. Kevin didn't just control how I was treated, he also tried to control who I was. He had rules about what I could and couldn't wear. No tight skirts. No dresses that show too much. Your hair should always be tied back. I didn't understand why my appearance was any of his business, but if I ever pushed back, he'd act offended, as if I was personally attacking him. "I'm just trying to teach you discipline. If you were my daughter, you'd have learned this already." I wasn't his daughter. I already had a dad. A dad who would never in a million years treat me like I was some object to control. The hardest part of all of this wasn't just Kevin. It wasn't even Brandon and Jake. It was the fact that I was losing my mother. She wasn't the same person anymore. Before Kevin, she may not have been the world's best mom, but at least she had been mine. At least she had pretended to care. Now everything she did revolved around him. She spent more time with Kevin's sons than she ever had with me. She helped them with homework, cheered them on at their sports games, actually acted like a mom, something she had never done for me. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Kevin had taken over. His sons had taken over. And my mom? She had let it happen. Kevin had a way of making everything feel like a military camp. From the moment he moved in, it was like he had declared himself the head of the household, and suddenly, there were rules for everything. I had to wake up at a certain time, even on weekends, because no one should be sleeping in past 8. I had to eat what was put in front of me, no complaints, no preferences, because this isn't a restaurant. I wasn't allowed to have my door locked, and if I ever did, Kevin would knock loudly until I opened it, telling me I had nothing to hide, and that privacy isn't the same as secrecy. He monitored my clothes, my schoolwork, my attitude, my tone of voice. Everything I did had to meet his impossible standards, and if I ever so much sighed in frustration, he would shake his head and mutter something about how I was spoiled and needed discipline. My mom didn't just let it happen. She encouraged it. Kevin's sons, Brandon and Jake, followed his lead. They didn't just make fun of me, they actively looked for ways to get under my skin. They would go into my room and move things around, not taking anything, just enough to mess with me. They would accidentally spill drinks on my homework, make fun of my taste in music, complain that I was too girly, or mock me for spending too much time alone. If I ever snapped back, I was the one being too sensitive. If I ignored them, Kevin would tell me I needed to learn to bond with my new brothers. No one stood up for me. My mom just brushed it off with a casual, "Oh, that's how siblings are," as if we had all grown up together and weren't complete strangers forced under the same roof. Kevin acted like I should be grateful he was even putting in the effort to raise me. He wanted me to call him Dad. I refused. Every time he mentioned it, I felt like my skin was crawling. I already had a dad, a real one who actually cared about me. But Kevin wasn't the type to take no for an answer. He would correct me in front of people, saying it's okay, she'll get used to it, as if I was some toddler learning a new word. He would tell my mom that I was being difficult, that I needed to accept that this is our family now. The worst part was my mom agreed. She started pushing it, too, saying things like, "Just try, for my sake." like it was some small inconvenience and not a complete erasure of my actual father. I tried to adapt, I really did. I tried to be civil, to follow the rules, to do what my mom wanted, but nothing was ever enough. If I did well in school, Kevin would say, well, that's expected, isn't it? If I struggled, he'd say, maybe if you weren't so focused on yourself all the time, you'd do better. If I stayed in my room, I was isolating myself. If I sat with them in the living room, I was acting like I didn't want to be there. It was like there was no right way to exist in that house. No matter what I did, I was always the problem. The favoritism was undeniable. Kevin's sons could do no wrong. They left their dishes in the sink and no one said a word, but if I so much as forgot to wipe the counter after making a sandwich, I got a lecture about responsibility. They could come home late without a single question, but if I wanted to go to a friend's house, I had to go through a full interrogation, followed by Kevin's famous, "I don't think that's necessary." They got everything handed to them: new clothes, new phones, extra money for going out. But if I asked for something, Kevin would cross his arms and say, "Why do you need that? You already have enough." And my mom, the one person who should have had my back, just nodded along like she had handed over all decision-making power to him. I miss my dad more than ever. We still talked, but he lived in another city now, and it wasn't like I could just pick up and move in with him. He knew things weren't perfect, but I didn't tell him the full extent of it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought he wouldn't be able to do anything. Maybe I thought my mom would get mad at me for stirring up drama. Or maybe I had just given up on the idea that anyone would ever put me first. Kevin had been talking about this vacation for weeks. It was supposed to be a big family trip, the kind that brings everyone closer together, according to him. He had chosen the location himself, booked the tickets, and planned every detail down to the last second. He acted like he was doing us all a favor, constantly reminding everyone how much money he was spending to make this trip happen. My mom was just as excited, gushing about how we deserved a break, and how this would be a fresh start for all of us. Even Brandon and Jake were thrilled, already talking about all the things they wanted to do. I wasn't as excited, but I told myself maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe, just for a little while, I could escape the constant tension at home. Maybe if we were all away from the house, Kevin would loosen up. A few days before the trip, my mom took me shopping for some vacation clothes. It wasn't really a bonding moment. She spent most of the time scrolling through her phone while I picked out what I needed, but it was still a rare moment alone with her. On the way back, we were stopped at a red light when out of nowhere, a car slammed into us from behind. The impact sent my head whipping forward so fast I barely registered what had happened. Everything felt like a blur after that. The next thing I knew, paramedics were pulling me out of the car and putting me onto a stretcher. My mom was shaken up but mostly fine, just a few bruises. I wasn't as lucky. My arm was in excruciating pain and everything felt hazy. They rushed me to the hospital where the doctors told me I had a fractured arm and a concussion. Kevin showed up not long after, his expression unreadable. At first, I thought maybe he was actually worried about me, but it didn't take long for his real concerns to surface. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't try to comfort me. His first question was whether we were still going on the trip. The moment the doctor told him I would need to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation, his entire attitude changed. He kept sighing, running his hands through his hair, pacing the room like he was the victim in all of this. He looked at my mom and said, "So what are we supposed to do now? We already paid for everything." That was what mattered to him. Not the fact that I was lying in a hospital bed, not the fact that I was in pain, not the fact that I had just been in a terrifying accident. Money. That was the only thing on his mind. I watched as my mom hesitated, torn between staying with me and going on the trip she had been so excited for. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she would choose me. Maybe, for once, she would put her child first. But Kevin wasn't going to let that happen. He kept pressuring her, saying it's just a few days, she'll be fine, and she's 15, not a little kid, and there are nurses here 24/7, what difference does it make if you're here or not? He made it seem like staying behind with me was some kind of burden, like the only logical choice was to leave me behind. I pleaded with her. I told her I didn't want to be alone. I told her I was scared. At first, she seemed torn, saying she wanted to stay, but Kevin kept pushing. He made it sound so easy, so reasonable, as if I was being dramatic for wanting my own mother by my side. Eventually, my mom gave in. She told me she would stay for the night, but after that, she had to go. She promised she would check in, promised she would make sure I was okay, but none of that mattered. She had already made her choice. I wanted to believe she felt guilty as she kissed my forehead before leaving the next day, but the second Kevin walked into the hospital to pick her up, she smiled like nothing had happened. I watched as they walked out of the room, laughing about something, completely unbothered by the fact that they were abandoning me. The moment they were out of sight, I felt the tears start falling. I had never felt so alone. The hospital room felt colder and quieter the moment my mother walked out. I kept staring at the door, half expecting her to change her mind and come back, to realize how messed up this was. But she didn't. She was gone. Off to her vacation with Kevin and his perfect little family, leaving me behind like an afterthought. I tried to stay strong, telling myself I'd be okay, that it was just a few days, but the weight of it all was crushing. The accident, the pain, the betrayal, it was too much. I curled up in the hospital bed, my arm throbbing, my head pounding, and for the first time in a long time, I just let myself cry. I must have been crying for a while because at some point, a nurse walked in and noticed me. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with kind eyes and a voice that was softer than I expected. She asked if I was in pain, but before I could even answer, she really looked at me. She saw the tear-streaked face, the swollen eyes, the way I was gripping the hospital blanket like it was the only thing keeping me together. She didn't just see a patient, she saw a kid who had been left behind. "Where's your family, sweetheart?" she asked gently. I hesitated. Saying it out loud made it feel too real, but the words came out anyway. "They left." She frowned like she was trying to make sense of it. "They just stepped out for a bit?" I shook my head. "No, they went on vacation." I watched her expression shift from confusion to shock and then to something that looked like quiet anger. She didn't say anything right away, just sat down next to me, her presence warm and steady. After a moment, she asked if I wanted her to call someone, an aunt, a grandparent, my dad. I hadn't even thought about my dad. I don't know why. Maybe because I had spent so long feeling like I had no one in my corner that it never occurred to me that he would drop everything to be here. Maybe because I had convinced myself that nothing would change, that I would just have to wait this out alone. The nurse must have seen my hesitation because she gently said, "Sweetheart, someone should know you're here." I gave her my dad's number. Part of me expected him to brush it off, maybe say something like, "It's just a few days, you'll be fine." After all, that's what Kevin said. That's what Mom had said. But when the nurse explained the situation, I heard my dad's voice on the other end of the call, and it was nothing like I expected. I had never heard him sound so angry. "What do you mean she's alone?" I heard him ask, his voice tight. "Where's her mother? Where's Kevin?" The nurse explained again, keeping her tone calm, but nothing could soften the reality of it. My mom had left me alone in a hospital after a car accident. She hadn't told my dad the truth, either. Apparently, when she spoke to him earlier, she had downplayed everything, calling it a minor fender bender, and saying I was fine. She hadn't mentioned the concussion. She hadn't mentioned the broken arm. She hadn't mentioned that she and Kevin had boarded a plane while I was stuck in a hospital bed. My dad was silent for a few moments, but I could hear his breathing, heavy and uneven. I could picture him gripping his phone, trying to contain his fury. When he spoke again, his voice was sharp. "I'm coming." I sat there in shock, gripping the blanket tighter. He was coming. For the first time since the accident, I didn't feel alone anymore. My dad arrived at the hospital 2 hours later, and the moment he walked through the door, I felt like I could finally breathe again. He looked furious, but not at me, at them. At my mother. At Kevin. At the fact that he had to find out from a nurse that his own daughter had been left alone in a hospital bed. He didn't even say anything at first, just walked straight over and pulled me into a hug. I hadn't realized how much I needed that until it happened. After making sure I was okay and speaking with my doctor, his anger boiled over. He tried calling my mom, but of course she didn't answer. He tried Kevin next. Nothing. They were probably sitting on a beach somewhere, sipping overpriced cocktails and pretending I didn't exist. That was when my dad made a decision that changed everything. He reported them to CPS. I don't think he had planned to, at least not at first. But after hearing the full story, from the accident to Kevin pressuring my mom to leave, to me spending the night in the hospital completely alone, he said enough was enough. This wasn't just neglect. It was abandonment. And it wasn't the first time my mother had put Kevin before me. It was just the worst time. By the time my mom and Kevin returned from their vacation, they were met with a CPS investigation. They had to sit down and explain themselves to justify why they thought it was okay to leave a 15-year-old girl in a hospital alone after a car accident. The investigator didn't seem impressed with their excuses, and from what I later found out, they were issued a formal warning. But my mother wasn't concerned about the warning. She was concerned about me. Not because she suddenly felt guilty. Not because she realized she had done something wrong. Because I told my dad the truth. When she finally called me, she didn't start with an apology. She started with anger. "How could you do this to me?" she hissed over the phone. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't mad at herself for abandoning me. She was mad at me for telling the truth. She told me CPS would be speaking to me soon and that I needed to make sure I didn't exaggerate. She warned me that if I told them anything too serious, they might take me away from her permanently. Then she said the thing that made my stomach drop. "You don't want to ruin this for Kevin, do you?" I gripped the phone tighter, suddenly realizing exactly what she meant. She didn't care about me. She cared about Kevin. About his reputation. About how this investigation could impact his standing with his ex-wife and his custody agreement. She was protecting him over me. Again. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped. "I'm not lying," I said, my voice firm. "I don't care what happens to Kevin. I don't care what happens to you. You left me in the hospital. That's the truth." My mother lost it. She started yelling, calling me selfish, telling me I was overreacting and that I was blowing everything out of proportion. She even tried guilt-tripping me, saying she had given me everything and this was how I repaid her. But I didn't care. Not anymore. For years I had let her push me aside. I had let Kevin treat me like an outsider in my own home. I had let them bully me into silence. But this was too far. So I stood my ground. When CPS called me for my statement, I told them everything. Moving in with my dad felt like stepping into a different world, one where I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells, where I wasn't waiting for the next rule to be thrown at me or for someone to find a reason to criticize me. It was quiet in a way that wasn't suffocating. For the first time in years, I could just exist without feeling like I had to prove something. My dad wasn't perfect, but he cared. He listened when I talked. He asked about my day without making it feel like an interrogation, and most of all, he respected me. He didn't demand that I call him the perfect parent or pretend that everything was fine overnight. He just made it clear that I was safe with him, and that was more than enough. At first, my mom kept trying to reach out, sending long-winded texts about how much she missed me and how we should talk things through. But none of her messages ever included an apology. She never once said she was sorry for what she did, never admitted that she had abandoned me in that hospital bed. It was always about how I was hurting her, how I was overreacting, how I had let my father poison me against her. She didn't get it. She never would. Eventually, I stopped responding. It wasn't worth my energy. Kevin never reached out at all, which wasn't surprising. He had never cared about me, and I was finally done caring about that. Living with my dad gave me a chance to heal. It wasn't instant. It wasn't like I woke up one day and suddenly felt whole again. But little by little, things got better. I stopped feeling like I had to look over my shoulder all the time. I stopped second-guessing every little thing I did, wondering if I was being too sensitive or causing trouble. I started focusing on myself. I did better in school. I started making actual friends, people I didn't feel like I had to constantly defend myself around. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually living my own life. Then my birthday came. First, I didn't think much of it. Birthdays had never been a big deal in my mom's house. She always made it clear that I shouldn't expect anything special, that birthdays were just another day. But my dad? He remembered. He told me to invite my friends over, ordered a massive pizza, and even got me a cake with my name on it, something that hadn't happened in years. We sat around watching cheesy movies, laughing until our stomachs hurt. And for the first time in forever, I felt like I belonged. It wasn't some grand, over-the-top celebration. It was just good. And that was enough. That night, as I sat in my room, surrounded by the warmth of people who actually cared, I realized something. I had spent so long waiting for my mother to choose me, for her to put me first. I had let her and Kevin, and their twisted version of a family, make me feel like I wasn't enough. But I was done waiting. I didn't need their approval, their validation, or their excuses. I had a home now, a real one, and I wasn't going back. Living with my dad felt like finally stepping out of a storm I didn't realize I had been trapped in for years. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could just breathe. There were no constant rules designed to make me feel small, no forced family bonding moments that left me feeling like an outsider, no criticism over the way I dressed, spoke, or existed. My dad treated me like a person, not an inconvenience, and that alone made all the difference. At first, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong, because I wasn't used to things being this easy. But days turned into weeks, and I started realizing that this wasn't temporary. This was my new reality. My mom still tried to reach out, sending texts about how she missed me, how she wanted to talk, how we could fix this if I would just be reasonable. But she never apologized. Not once did she say, "I'm sorry for leaving you in that hospital." Not once did she acknowledge what she had done. Every message she sent was about her, how I had hurt her, how my dad had turned me against her, how Kevin was devastated by my betrayal. She didn't get it. She never would. Eventually, I just stopped responding. It wasn't worth it. Kevin never reached out at all, which honestly wasn't a surprise. He had never cared about me before, and now that I was out of his life, I was sure he had already erased me from his version of reality. That was fine by me. At first, I didn't know what to do with all the freedom. I was so used to feeling like I had to defend myself all the time that it took me a while to adjust. I kept expecting my dad to suddenly start laying down rules, to try and control me the way Kevin did, but he never did. He gave me space when I needed it, but he also showed up. He asked me about my day because he actually cared, not because he was looking for something to criticize. He didn't try to replace the years I lost, didn't act like moving in with him would suddenly erase all the damage, but he let me know, *** over and over again, that I wasn't alone anymore. ***. Slowly I started to heal. I focused on school not because I was afraid of getting yelled at, but because I actually wanted to do well. I made real friends, people I didn't have to constantly be on guard around, people who liked me for who I was. I started figuring out who I was outside of the mess my mother had created. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to anyone. Then my birthday came and I barely thought about it at first. Birthdays had always been a non-event in my mother's house. She never made a big deal out of them, always telling me that I shouldn't expect anything special, that birthdays were just another day. But my dad? He remembered. He told me to invite my friends over, ordered way too much pizza, and even got me a cake with my name on it. ***, something that hadn't happened in years. ***, we sat around watching cheesy movies, laughing over dumb inside jokes, and eating until we felt sick. And for the first time in forever, I felt normal. I felt like I belonged. It wasn't a big, extravagant celebration. It wasn't some dramatic event. It was just good. And that was enough. That night, as I sat in my room, staring at the birthday candles before blowing them out, I realized something. I had spent so much time waiting for my mother to choose me, waiting for Kevin to accept me, waiting for things to get better, waiting to feel like I mattered, ***, but I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't looking for their approval or their love or their half-hearted attempts at pretending I was part of their family. I had a home now, a real one, and I wasn't going back.